Are you coming in here to check out books? Yeah. Study space is a big one, but we also deal in a lot of technology today. And because most of our collections are now digital, meaning they're online, but we still license them, the library is becoming a place where people look for digital information instead of information inside physical materials like books. So librarians, we figured out, are good at organizing books. They're good at organizing electronic journals and other digital information. So why shouldn't they be doing this with data, right? They're all different sorts of research output, and librarians have the organizational skills to get these things done. So I think the moral of the story of these three sides is that when you come to the library, or when you think about libraries, I'd like you to think of libraries as a place to come to get expertise, okay? So not only do we do all the organizational stuff, we also do educational things about how to find materials, different ways to search for things, and also helping you organize your own research output outside of the library. And on top of all of this, the libraries support open access. So I guess the short answer to the question that I posed in the title of this talk is, why would I let a librarian anywhere near my research data? The answer is open data, because librarians and people that work at libraries have the skills to help research plan, organize, and describe and share their research data. Okay. So for the rest of the talk, the major questions I'm going to be asking and answering is, why do we care about open data? What are the roles of the library in this process in detail? And how can the CSU library specifically help with your research data? And I'd like to begin this section of the talk with a disclaimer. I understand that data management and data sharing are not the same thing. They're kind of like overlapping bubbles. So you've got your data sharing bubble over here. You can share data that isn't well managed. I could go put a spreadsheet full of numbers on Facebook, and that's technically data sharing. However, it's bad data sharing because nobody's going to find it because nobody looks for data on Facebook. And also, since I didn't have any descriptive information, nobody's going to be able to use it even if they did find it. You can also use good data management practices and never share your data. And this is entirely appropriate with things like private data. Like, my tax information is pretty well organized in my files, but there's no way that I'm going to share it with you all. All right? So the reason that I kind of use these terms interchangeably sometimes during the talk, and I guess we'll throw open data in there with data sharing, is that the same principles apply to both. If you want to share your data, following good data management practices are key for people to find and understand your data. But even if you're never going to share your data, these practices are also useful because you are the only future user of your data. So think about sharing your data today with you from 5 years from now, I guess. All right? So it'll be a bit of a mishmash of terminology, but in some ways they're all kind of in the same area. So as a researcher, why should you care about data management? Well, researchers already clearly care about their data. This is a postcard that was submitted at the Day of Data at Columbia University when the organizers asked researchers to submit postcards with their feelings about their data. So you can see that, at least for this person, it elicited a wide range of feelings, very strong emotions, because data is so intrinsically tied to your success as a researcher. And that's very understandable. So why should we care about data management? Well, it's all the things that you do during your research to take care of your data and make sure that it stays around for a long time and is usable. So it's the policies, practices, procedures needed to manage the storage, access, and preservation of the data produced from a research project. So it's not just one thing. It's not at the end of the project. It's not at the beginning of the project. It's through the whole course of your project. And it's becoming an even bigger deal now because everything is digital. I mean, not everything, obviously, but a lot of research data is born digital. It's never on paper. Managing this type of information takes new skills, because if you take a lab notebook and leave it in a file cabinet for 10 years, it's probably going to be there after the 10 years, provided there's no natural disasters or things like that. But if you take a file and put it on a thumb drive or a zip drive or something like that, 10 years later, you don't know if you're going to have the technology to read those files. You don't know if you're going to have the technology to even plug in that drive. So it takes a different set of management skills to deal with. Also, data are ephemeral. So let's say you have your thesis on a thumb drive and you drop the thumb drive on your way to the bus. That's just gone, okay? You'd be more likely to notice dropping a notebook than a tiny little piece of technology. And also, because it's digital, the final thing is that it facilitates sharing. So in some ways, data sharing is, we have to do data sharing now because we can do data sharing now. Okay? And on top of all this, there's more researchers than ever. This is a graph across time on the x-axis, and on the y, it's how many doctorate recipients there are in different fields. So the main point of this is just that it's going up every year. This is causing the global scientific output to double about every 9 years. But even though we're having more research than ever before, the availability of the research data that's associated with these articles that are being published degrades over time. So the first step of actually accessing the data in traditional publishing models is that you have to have a working email address for the corresponding author. By 20 years after publication, you only have about a 50% chance of getting that. If you have a working email address, they only respond about half the time, even as soon as like a year past publication. So that's not a great statistic. Even if they answer your email, only 3/4 of the time do they actually tell you anything about whether the data exists or not. They might just say, no, you can't have it, right? And if the status of the data is known, if the status is known, the chance of the data actually being available for use goes down dramatically between 10 and 20 years, right? So the moral of the story for all of this is that we're losing vast amounts of data. And this is pretty important lately because research funding is tight. Despite the fact that we're adding more and more PhDs to the pool of people that want to get research funding, the funding levels are pretty much flat, with the notable exception here in the 90s of a really huge bump in biomedical research. Because of this, funders want to do more research with less money. They've started by recommending open access, not just for publications, but also for data. They're moving into mandating it now, like by proposing that you have data management plans with grant applications. But currently, for most funding agencies, it's not enforced. So they make you write a plan for how you're going to share your data, but they don't ever actually check up at it at the end. But now we're moving into the area where this is going to be enforced. So you're not going to be able to get your next grant if you don't have your previous grant data published. So this is what the founder of the repository Figshare that was mentioned in the last talk calls the open academic tidal wave. And it's got a lot of momentum right now, primarily because of the support of the funding agencies, and the momentum's not slowing. And all of this is backed up by a White House statement. And basically what this text boils down to is that taxpayers pay for your research dollars. Their tax dollars are paying for research grants. And since they are funding the research, they need to have access to the research products, essentially. And out of the funding agencies in the US, NSF probably has the strongest data sharing policy. And they explicitly state that investigators are expected to share the research with other researchers. And they have a laundry list of things that you need to share, such as primary data, samples, physical collections, and basically anything else that could be helpful for the research. So things like field books, protocols, etc. And probably the strongest part of this is the last statement, that grantees are expected to encourage and facilitate such sharing. So it's the researcher's job to do this. But now that we've thoroughly discussed the stick, let's discuss the carrot a little bit. So data sharing is also important because it's good for science. Data sharing can produce or improve research reproducibility. Sorry, that word is hard to say when you're talking fast. So it improves research reproducibility through transparency. So if you provide all of your data and all of your code for your analysis, then other people can replicate your study. It also improves efficiency and spurs innovation through having things be open and accessible, right? Additionally, it's good for your career as an individual researcher. As I said before, you're the future user of your data. I said think about sharing your data with you from 5 years from now. Also think of it as the you from 5 years ago is really terrible at answering email. So if you're the corresponding author on your own research, you better be able to figure out what your research said and how to access it, right? The other good thing is that your data get used and either your data or the associated papers get cited. So this will increase your impact in the scientific community. It also exposes you to collaborators, because if they can see your data and identify a reason to work with you, then they'll probably contact you. And also, the funding agencies are getting really serious about data sharing plans. So having a good data sharing plan is going to make your grant applications more competitive. Okay, so now that we have a good idea about what data management is and why it's important, when do you do it? So how does data management fit into the research cycle? And it's pretty much throughout the whole thing, as I alluded to earlier. So typically, the research cycle goes like this. You start out with a hypothesis. You design experiments to address that hypothesis. You collect data. You analyze the data into results. You write an article based on these results and publish it. And then that article can be used to generate new hypotheses, either for your research group or for other research groups. But if we overlay the concepts of data management onto this cycle with all the digital data that we have produced, even before you start collecting your data, it's a good idea to write a data management plan so that you start thinking about these things throughout the data lifecycle before they become a problem. Also, the process of going from data to results has gotten more complicated. Because data is big, so a lot of this stuff has to be automated. Data is also messy, which is relatively easy for humans to deal with, but since you have to automate things, you have to use computers. And to use computers, you have to put things in formats that computers can understand. So cleaning the raw data that comes off of the machines to tidy data and analyzing that tidy data to results, you can save a lot of time by automating it. Also, we talked about this primarily, you no longer just share the article, you can share your data sets. And since you're using computer code to automate your processes, you can also share your research code. And now you can get credit for 3 different things, essentially. And all 3 of these things can be reused to generate new hypotheses. Okay? So the moral of the story here is that the research cycle has gotten a lot more complicated since the advent of data sharing and digital data. All right? So how do the libraries fit into this? Well, number 1 point is that we do not want to be the data police. Okay? We're not trying to impose any extra rules or regulations on you. We want to help you comply with the regulations that are already out there and give you best practices for how to deal with them. And to meet this end, we provide data services. All right, so the web presence for our data management services is just at the library's website. If you go under the Services tab, there'll be a listing for data management. And it has some brief descriptions of the different types of topics that we're willing to advise on for data sharing. So that's kind of the web portal. There's also workshops that we run. Have any of you guys heard of Data and Donuts? Well, those of you that don't work in the library. Yeah, so once a month in the morning on I think the second Wednesday of the month, 10 o'clock, we talk about data and eat some donuts. It's pretty laid back. There's a web page for this to register for the events. I think they're all full, but I'm going to start a parallel series just because there's a lot of interest. But the good thing about these is that all of the course content is posted online, and that's linked off of this website. So if you miss one or you've never heard of this before and you want to catch up, there are YouTube videos that are linked with the materials. The other thing that we're going to start doing soon is start hosting carpentry workshops. Have any of you guys heard about data carpentry or software carpentry? Yep, looks like the library people know. All right, so these are nonprofit organizations that teach basic computing skills to scientists. The software carpentry stuff is more along the lines of how to use Unix and programming languages. So it's kind of a little bit more geared to high-performance computing, but the data carpentry stuff starts where a lot of, at least biological researchers are. At least it's where I was when I was in grad school, where you're basically using a spreadsheet program like Excel for your lab notebook. And it takes you from how you have it formatted in a spreadsheet, cleaning it up, getting it into machine-readable format, and then learning how to program in R or Python to actually do reproducible analyses. So these are actually really great workshops. They're usually 2 days, and hopefully we'll be running some in the event hall sometime next year. The other types of service that we provide are one-on-one meetings. So if you have questions like, how do I write a data management plan, organize my data, clean and format my data, how do I automate things, how do I get things ready and share. These are all things that are addressed in Data and Donuts, but when I do Data and Donuts, it's basically, I'm talking to the most general audience possible because everybody at the university is welcome to come to these sessions. But not every data is kind of its own unique snowflake. So if you want to sit down with me and talk about your data specifically for an hour or so, we're happy to do that. We've already done this with people who want to put their data in our institutional repository, which I'll talk about next. But happy to sit down and talk to you during about how to manage your data during your project, because that's kind of the next step. All right, so I already alluded to this, but we also have a service where you can archive your data if you want to make it open in the CSU's Digital Repository, which is part of the Digital Collections of Colorado. There's already 78 data sets in here, which is pretty good. So if you decide to put your data in here, you won't be alone. And putting your data into the institutional repository will satisfy requirements for manuscripts and grants. So if you have a publisher or a funding agency that would like you to share your data, we can get it in a form and put it into this repository so that it can be reused and satisfy these requirements. The great thing about this is that if your data set is relatively small, actually less than 1 terabyte, it's at no cost to the researcher. So we'll help you get it in the right format and put it in the repository and basically archive it more or less forever. But kind of more till question mark, I guess. But if it's bigger than 1 terabyte, then it's $150 per terabyte if you want to store it for 5 years or less, or $300 per terabyte for more than 5 years. But that's not a recurring cost. That's an upfront cost when you put it in there, and then it's there for the time period indicated for the cost structure you used. Okay. So let's just take a closer look at some of the data sets that are in the repository already. We have a few larger projects, and I define large projects basically by projects that have more than one data set associated with them. And the first one involves a research station in the Shortgrass Steppe that has a lot of grassland ecology data. There's actually 32 different data sets in this collection. If you want to look at the specific collection, one of the things that we provide with the repository is a handle. So this is a unique identifier for your research data that you can put in your dissertations or manuscripts. And then if people just type this in a web browser, it'll bring you directly to your data. There's another type of unique identifier that you're probably more familiar with called the DOI. And we'll be able to mint those too from DSpace if your requirement or your funder or publisher requires a DOI. So this is a picture from one of the field sites. It's absolutely beautiful. But the reason that this project went into the repository was that there was a field site being decommissioned, and they had a ton of data, but no money to take care of the data anymore. So my colleague Dan Draper and other people at the CSU libraries were able to help the person that was managing the data, Nicole Kaplan, to get it into the repository and get all the metadata straight so people will know how to use it. There's another ecological project studying willow trees in Yellowstone National Park that has 20-some data sets in there. And there's also a civil engineering data set that has some hydraulic data about a really strong rain event after a fire. So we're trending toward the ecological here, but those are just the big data sets that we have. If you look across all of the data sets that we have, this pie chart is excluding the ones on the previous slide, but you can see they're from a variety of fields like crop and soil science, psychology, ecology, and even some clinical stuff in here from the vet school. So the system can handle a wide variety of data sets. So if you feel like your data might be appropriate to put in here, just talk to us and we'll figure out how to set you up. All right. So the take-home points here are basically that data management requires new skills because everything's digital, and we have new requirements put on us as researchers. I also want you to know that the library staff have those skills, not just here, but at other libraries. So if you're a postdoc and you go to somewhere else, talk to the library and see if they have any of these services, because If these services existed when I was in grad school, I certainly didn't know about them. Also, I want you to know about the specific ways that the CSU libraries can help. So check out our educational sessions. Set up a one-on-one meeting with me by emailing me. My contact information is on the next slide. And also the ability to put your research data in an archive format to openly share in the digital repository. All right, I flew through my slides. So hopefully you guys have some questions and we can have a discussion about open data. Or I guess we can continue our discussion on open access journals since our speaker's still here. Yeah.
Question. As a librarian, you talked about the skills that librarians have the skills to help with data management. I suspect that there may be a lot of librarians who are awfully intimidated by the idea of assisting with data management. I mean, just the word data alone is a little bit scary. Any thoughts or advice for librarians who would like to get over that?
So the question was asking about like the intimidation factor of saying that you're working with data instead of organizing some other type of material. And I would say that data is a digital object just like a journal. I know that the publishers are better at providing what metadata need to be provided than scientists are. But I think the biggest thing that I would say is to ask a lot of questions. Because even as a researcher who has dealt with data my entire scientific career, when I go to talk to an ecology lab group, I don't know anything about their data set. And I end up asking a ton of questions about it. And most of them boil down to, like, what do you think other people are going to care about if they're going to reuse this data? So it's very externally focused. And so it's basically just, what do you think is important? What do you think other people will find important? And also, the other thing is that depending on what field the data is in, there are a lot of standards out there. So if you search for metadata standards or ontologies that are associated in certain fields, you might find something that's really perfect for the data set that you're working with. But you don't have to know that. You just have to know where to point people. Or you could say, hey, this seems like something that would be relevant to your project, and have them look at it. Because ultimately, I give them the first right of refusal for all of this. Like, I will tell them what the best practices are, but it's not my data. Yeah.
What subject areas do you find to be more interested in this sort of thing?
Like we've seen with the big data sets that are in there, the people at NREL, so the ecology lab, have been really interested. And I think people that receive NSF funding are already familiar with this concept because they've had to write data management plans for a long time, even if they're not necessarily being enforced. I'd say the most resistant population has been in the biomedical field. And I don't know if it's a cultural thing or the fact that they're so used to dealing with privileged and private health information that they don't think they can share it. But even if the information is privileged, or needs to stay private, there are ways to share parts of it. So I try to, when I'm doing these teaching experiences, that's why I frame it as, I'm going to talk about data sharing, but it's not, you don't necessarily have to share it to find this stuff useful. So I try to nudge them in ways and show them how they can do it, but I find that pushing it too hard with certain groups gets a little alienating. Any other questions?
Do you have any thoughts on, this is obviously data, it's more, driven through the hard sciences and somewhat the social sciences, but what about digital humanities? Does that ever kind of cross into this at all?
Yeah, so one of the things that I learned at Data and Donuts is that there are people on this campus who are in the humanities, specifically digital humanities, that are interested in this stuff. And a lot of that centers around text mining. So if you have a corpus of text that you want to look at for patterns and words and stuff, essentially your raw data is the text itself. But the processed data would be something like word counts and things like that. And I'm not super familiar with how to manage or analyze text mining or text data and with mining, but there's a whole data carpentry curriculum about it in the social sciences. So, yeah. So there's interest, but I feel like it's even more new in the humanities than it is in the sciences. Other questions?
I have a question for Dr. Kooth.
Yeah.
What do you see as a sustainable model for open access publishing in the humanities? Yeah. Because it's, well, I mean, of course, I mean, you work in the sciences, so I mean, that's your steer. But it is interesting when you aren't talking about grants and things like that, how that will work.